Welcome to the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, a battle report using the Black Seas rules from Warlord Games. This battle pits 2,000 points of Spanish ships of the line against 2,000 points of British over 8 turns. The Spanish historically had very heavily armed vessels, but with not very experienced crew. The Spanish fleet was led by the largest and most powerful ship in the world, the Santisima Trinidad, followed by a first-rate, third-rate, and 2 frigates. Its opponent was the venerable and feared British Royal Navy. Its crew was seasoned and well-drilled, and very highly disciplined. At the head of the British fleet was the most celebrated ship in the Royal Navy, the HMS Victory. Commodore Horatio Nelson was behind the helm of the HMS Captain, and they were flanked by a first-rate and 2 frigates. On February 14, 1797, these 2 large fleets met just off the coast of Portugal. The aggressive British fleet sailed in at a perpendicular angle against the Spanish, cutting their line in half. With only half of the Spanish fleet to contend with, the smaller British Navy aimed to make their mark and save their island nation from a French and Spanish invasion. The goal of each fleet is to maximize the amount of damage that they do to each other. The Spanish to try to cripple the British fleet, or for preventing the Spanish from landing on English soil. Who will reign supreme and will history be rewritten? Watch and see. On this day of battle, the seas will calm, and a strong breeze was blowing west to east, propelling all the ships along. The battle began to unfold. The ships noticed each other's masts on the horizon and started to engage. The weather gauge favored the Spaniards, and the ships were sailing in lines of battle. This gave both fleets the advantage of combining all their guns together to fire in one continuous line. The Santisima Trinidad is at the head of the Spanish line. It is extremely well armed, but very hard to maneuver. Noticing his vulnerability to raking fire, the Spanish captain steers the heavy first-rate hard port side. With most guns being out of range, the Santisima Trinidad holds its fire. The St. Joseph and the St. Nicholas form the rest of the Spanish line. On the southern end of the ocean come the British. The first in line is the HMS Victory. Traveling at battle sails, it pulls the rest of the line behind it to get within gun range of the Spanish fleet. Third in the British line is the HMS Captain, the third rate, helmed by Commodore Horatio Nelson. The ships for both fleets are now set on a course for impending battle. The winds continued blowing east, giving the Spanish line the weather gauge and a clear advantage. Santisima Trinidad continues to pull the Spanish line into a more favorable gunning position. A slight course correction and battle sails brings it within range of the HMS Victory. The massive 3-decker flagship opens up all its gun ports, takes aim, and opens fire. The starboard side of the Spanish flagship thundered to life with flame and smoke from its 8, 12, and 24-pounder guns. The crews were fresh and ready, giving every gun maximum attention and maximizing the deadly broadsides. Wood panels shattered and splintered under the heavy barrage. The crew of the HMS Victory were cut down to ribbons, and the ones who survived started scrambling to contain the damage. One of the heavy 24-pounder cannonballs smashed into a structural bulkhead, weakening the British flagship. Another cannonball smashed into a powder keg and set it ablaze. Fire began to spread, and so did mild panic among the normally disciplined crew. The Spanish line followed their capital ship closely, with the St. Joseph in second and the third-rate St. Nicholas right behind it. Joining them in the rear were the fifth-rate frigates Diana and Ceres. The battle was not starting well for the British fleet. Their lead ship, the HMS Victory, was damaged and on fire. The Victory's crew was seasoned and skilled, but they were not able to put out the spreading conflagration. Nevertheless, Captain Calder continued to push his crew and ship forward. "To your stations, men! This will not go unanswered! Ready the guns!" The Victory's crew wheeled out the portside guns, every one of them primed and trained onto the huge Spanish first rate. "Ready? Make aim! Fire!" In a staccato of cannon fire and smoke, The portside cannons laid into the Santisima Trinidad, scoring hits against the massive hull. As the smoke cleared, screams of dying men and snapping lines filled the air. Some shots wrecked the superstructure, causing the ship to moan under its own weight. The HMS Britannia followed in line behind the Victory, but with no guns in range, it could only watch as the ship in front of it got pummeled. The HMS Captain, Commodore Nelson commanding, grew impatient. With favorable wind in his sails, he gave an order to go to full sails. It defied the Admiral's direct orders to remain in a line. "What in the bloody hell is he doing?" yelled Vice Admiral Thompson from the Britannia. The captain's bow chasers trained forward, confirmed range, and fired. Gunners tried to keep aim, but the ship was sailing too fast and bucking against the waves. The shots went wide. Captain Cockburn of the HMS Minerve looked with stunned disbelief. "What'll we do, sir?" asked the first mate. Cockburn paused and then said,
"Well, this is unexpected. Hard port, helmsman. We take the fight to the Spanish."
Following Nelson's example, the Minerve went port side, sails bellowing in the wind. It took aim at the Santisima Trinidad, and its 6-pound bow chasers opened fire. The 6-pound shot scored a firm hit, punching a hole through the second deck. It continued crashing through wood and flesh and took out a structural beam. The HMS Lively pulled up just in time to see the British line dissolve in front of it. The winds remained at a steady easterly breeze, filling sails and heavily favoring the Spanish line, which was still intact. The British had the HMS Minerve and Captain acting first, then the Lively, and the 2 first rates. The loss of key crew members on the Santisima Trinidad made it unable to perform complex maneuvers. The large Spanish flagship inched forward on battle sails, aligning its starboard guns on the rapidly approaching HMS Captain. The captain of the Santisima Trinidad noticed the opportunity for raking fire. The starboard cannons belched fire and death. Shots rained down on the HMS Captain, bouncing down the entire length of the top deck. Yards snapped, lines fell into heaps, and planks of wood shattered into deadly shrapnel. Men lay dying or dead on the blood-soaked decks. "Commodore, sir! The wheel is stuck!" cried the helmsman. The rest of the Spanish ships followed that lead, keeping their line intact and bringing more guns to bear. Aboard the San Josef, starboard guns trained on the HMS Captain as well and opened fire. Like many Spanish first rates, the San Josef was impressively well armed. It was the crew's first shots of the day, and they were eager to get stuck in. 6, 12, and 24-pound cannonballs whistled through the air and slammed into the battered HMS Captain, dealing horrible damage and death. Officers under Nelson's command were mowed down, and several powder kegs caught fire and ignited. The situation on the HMS Captain grew more grim. But the Spanish showed no mercy. Seeing the flames lick out of the British third rate spurred the St. Nicholas along. Opening up its starboard gun ports as well, it continued the brutal barrage on Commodore Nelson's ship. The San Nicolas was also firing for the first time, and her crew was relatively well trained compared to the rest of the Spanish Navy. All the starboard side guns fired, and almost all found their marks. The HMS Captain was falling apart. The Spanish frigates Diana and Ceres formed the rear of the line. They were eager to get into action, but the British fleet wasn't within broadsides or cannon range. Both frigate captains had to contend with keeping the Spanish line intact and waiting for another opportunity. Captain Cockburn and the crew of the HMS Minerve cringed at the damage that the HMS Captain was taking. He had to intervene and engage the Spanish close up. The Minerve's 6-pound bow chasers targeted the San Josef. The shots hit, but barely scratched the first rate.
Come hard starboard. Gun batteries, make ready.
Yelled Captain Cockburn to his men. The gun ports opened, the guns wheeled out, took aim, and fired. The frigate was much lighter armed compared to the first-rate San Josef, but that did not deter the Minerve. The broadsides filled the area between the ships with smoke as the shots found home. A 24-pound Carronade shot found a joist and shattered it, causing the upper deck of the St. Joseph to buckle. On the HMS Captain, the fire raged. Nelson removed his bicorn and frowned. Half of his crew lay dead, with no one to fight the flames. With the wheel jammed and the sails stuck in full without enough men to lower them, the HMS Captain raced forward out of control, right into the Spanish fleet. The ship careened hard to port. Nelson barked sharp orders for the bow chasers to fire. The HMS Captain may be doomed, but she was not going down without a fight. Nelson could hear the structure of the San Nicolas take a direct hit. The HMS Captain continued to pull port side. He looked to his right and saw his starboard broadsides line up with the St. Joseph.
Starboard batteries, make ready. Aye, sir. Starboard guns, fire.
His lieutenant's orders were followed by a long string of cannon fire. Whatever men that were left all ran to man the guns, and even under great duress were able to ready, aim, and fire accurately. Gaping holes littered the side of the Spanish first rate. The quarterdeck took a direct hit, leaving the St. Joseph in disarray. The HMS Captain headed directly for the frigate Diana. With the rudder still jammed and with no men to lower the sails, Nelson could only brace for a collision. However, the Diana was a nimble ship, and its attentive captain steered at the last minute, narrowly missing the impact. Captain Lord Garleys of the 32-gun frigate HMS Lively was last on the scene. Eager to engage, he ordered full sails. The nimble British frigate sped ahead with a strong wind pushing it along. It jockeyed for position, but the other ships obstructed its view. Lord Garleys will have to wait for another opening. The weather gauge was now on the HMS Victory. The fire was starting to come under control. With keen discipline and speed, the crew doused the flames with buckets of water. The Victory surged ahead, and the portside guns roared to life. The shots connected and dealt terrible mayhem to the Spanish flagship. Heavy lead shot tore into multiple decks, knocking out cannons, killing gun crew, and spraying the insides with deadly wood shrapnel. One cannonball cut the helmsman clean in half, and the suddenly unmanned wheel turned wildly. Vice Admiral Thompson of the HMS Britannia scowled in red-faced frustration at what Nelson had done. The British line was in tatters. He was adamant to maintain the Admiral's orders and kept right behind the HMS Victory. The winds remained unchanged. The Spanish line saw the weather gauges favor once again, followed by the HMS Captain, Lively, Minerve, and the British line of first rates. The Santisima Trinidad didn't have a helmsman, causing the ship to buck port side. It maintained battle sails as it steered away from the British line, but as fortune would have it, its starboard broadside batteries lined up perfectly with the HMS Victory. Jose de Cordoba ordered the cannons to fire. But the guns were much quieter this time. Several cannon were shattered, others had powder kegs smashed, and gun crews were mauled and in disarray. Only a handful of the ship's 130 guns barked to life. Most of those guns found British lumber. Another sailor took the wheel of the Santisima Trinidad. It continued ahead, pulling the Spanish line behind it. Commodore Francis Javier Wintusen lay dead on the quarterdeck, forcing the flag captain to take over. The San Josef was in chaos and didn't correct its heading. Nonetheless, it found the HMS Britannia on its starboard and fired. The San Josef's impressive battery of guns roared to life. The gun crew, however, was inexperienced and struggled to get a good lead on the British ship. Of the many Spanish guns, only a handful found their mark. Even so, the HMS Britannia suffered crippling crew deaths. The survivors scrambled to fill vacant positions. With the untimely death of the San Josef's captain, the Spanish line had finally broken. The San Nicolas closely followed the San Josef and found the frigate HMS Minerve to its starboard. The Spanish guns wheeled out and ignited to life. Shots rang out from the broadside and found solid contact against the British fifth rate. The frigate Diana scrambled her gunners to the starboard side and laid down an opportune volley. The Diana was not as well armed as the Spanish first or third rates, but the HMS Captain was in serious trouble, and Commander Juan Jose Valera of the Diana could sense that victory was close at hand. No ship under the command of Horatio Nelson had ever struck its colors under any circumstance, and the HMS Captain would not do so today. The Ceres followed in line behind its sister frigate, training its starboard side batteries on the crippled HMS Captain. Its guns were freshly loaded with powder and shot, and the gunners lit the fuses. The 34-gun Spanish frigate wasn't heavily armed, but at point-blank range, its guns didn't miss. The HMS Captain continued to get pulverized. Nelson's crew continued to perish from punishing Spanish firepower. Spanish Marines fired muskets, but didn't hit anything meaningful. The fire on the HMS Captain continued to burn, with no one able to fight it. Sails were engulfed, and lines snapped as they burned. The strong wind blowing east caught the sails from the front and snapped the foremast. Crews dove out of the way as it crashed onto the top deck. The HMS Captain was well below quarter strength and down to just its mizzenmast. Worse yet, it was heading straight for the Ceres. Both ships collided, throwing men from both sides overboard and gouging huge holes in the hulls. The Ceres was crushed under the larger ship's bow, and the HMS Captain's waterline began springing leaks. The ships listed away from each other, neither crew able to do anything but hang on for their lives. Captain Garleys of the HMS Lively ordered battle sails and surged ahead to engage the third-rate San Nicolas. Its bow chasers fired, but barely nicked the larger Spanish ship. The Lively surged ahead, aiming its bow toward the San Josef, with the intent on grappling and bringing the fight to the Spaniards. On the way, its port side guns lined up on the nearby Diana. The HMS Lively was an even match for the Spanish frigate, its lighter array of guns ablaze and showering the Diana with lead. "Come on, men! Grapple that Spanish ship! Let's avenge the HMS Captain!" With expert seamanship, the crew and marines of the HMS Lively hurled barbed grapples onto the top deck of the San Josef, pulling both ships together. Sailors and marines from the HMS Lively ran across the boarding planks between the ships, and fierce fighting ensued. Swords slashed, grenades were lobbed from the Lively's crow's nest, and pistols were discharged. The San Nicolas had a larger crew, but the ferocity of the British melee caught them off guard. The crew of the Lively drove the Spaniards back, leaving a pile of bodies in their wake. But the San Nicolas had more men, and from the lower decks, they began streaming up to join the fight. On battle sails, the frigate HMS Minerve pulled between the Spanish and British lines. Its portside guns began to target the Santisima Trinidad, who was starting to show severe battle scars from the constant British bombardment. The frigate fired what few guns it had and scored more deadly hits on the flagship. Some of the shots landed squarely on the quarterdeck, killing the lieutenant and the midshipmen. The Minerve pulled up to the Santisima Trinidad, a ship 4 times its size. Wanting to impress the HMS Victory, it tossed its grappling hooks onto the giant first rate, and the sailors heaved the 2 ships together. Fierce fighting broke out as the crew and marines of the HMS Minerve climbed up their grapples, trying to get to the top deck of the taller Spanish flagship. The British fought the Spanish through exposed gun ports and made their way up to the railings and started clashing blades with their foes. But the Spanish outnumbered them. Pistols flashed, lead balls struck climbing British on the grappling lines. For every Spanish killed, 2 or 3 British fell instead. Yet, the tiny frigate kept fighting and kept pushing the attack, however desperate it may have been. On board the Victory, Admiral Sir John Jervis looked on.
Ready the portside guns, Captain.
Captain Calder went pale.
But, sir, the Minerve, they're... Just do it, Captain. We all make sacrifices.
In one giant barrage, the Minerve was blasted to pieces and began to sink. But the Santisima Trinidad also took damage. British Marines fired their muskets at point-blank range, but to no avail. The HMS Victory's crew hoisted grapples, but in the shock of what happened to the Minerve, their tosses were half-hearted and failed. Vice Admiral Thompson noticed that the British line was gone, so he ordered the HMS Britannia to steer starboard. Wheeling its portside guns out, the order was given to fire on the St. Joseph. The British first-rate's guns connected, sending planks and yards hurling on the Spanish ship. Cannonballs smashed into the ship's helm, freezing the St. Joseph's rudder in place. The HMS Britannia sallied forth, trying to find an opening to get a grapple, but its path was obstructed. With no lines remaining intact, both British and Spanish fleets were now locked in individual ship-to-ship fights for survival. The wind remained constant, giving the HMS Captain the weather gauge. Followed by the small Spanish line of frigates, the St. Nicolas, the Lively, then the Santisima Trinidad, the Victory, and finally, the Britannia. The HMS Captain, still on fire, but finally able to muster enough men to fight it, desperately tried to douse the flames, and they succeeded. With the wind directly ahead, Commodore Nelson skillfully ordered his crew to tack the captain's starboard. As the sails filled, Nelson noticed the stern shot on the Ceres and gave the order to fire. The limping British third rate had barely enough crew to man its starboard guns, but whatever guns it had remaining, Nelson made them count. Shots tore through the entire length of the Ceres. Masts toppled, hull compromised, and crew almost all dead. The terrified Spanish survivors hoisted the ensign down. The Ceres struck its colors. The captain's crew was jubilant, but Nelson knew his ship couldn't fight anymore. The Diana was on a collision course with the anchored and engaged St. Nicolas. Fortunately, the captain of the Diana was deft enough to stop the ship short of disaster. He then tried to grapple the HMS Lively, but the attempt fell short. The surrendered Ceres was next on a collision course with the Diana, but both ships made quick maneuvers and avoided each other. Meanwhile, the fierce melee continued between the San Nicolas and the HMS Lively. Even though the British frigate had fewer men than the Spanish third rate, it matched the Spaniards blow for blow, not giving an inch. Men lay dead and bleeding all over the top deck of the San Nicolas. Where Spanish sailors fell, others from the lower deck took their place and pushed on. After a while, the advantage seemed to sway to the side of the San Nicolas, but the Lively would not give in. Combat continued to rage, and it was evident that the HMS Lively could not keep this up. Spaniards from the third rate began to jump over onto the top deck of the British frigate and took the fight to them. Again, the superior numbers of the Spanish began to push British sailors and Marines back. The lively sporting action was starting to get repelled, and the British line began to waver. Yet, Captain Lord Garleys's men refused to surrender, especially with Admiral John Jervis watching them from the Victory. On the east end of the ocean, the San Josef found itself with a jammed rudder. While sailing straight ahead, the captain of the Spanish first rate turned to stern and saw a faint silhouette of the British third rate. It was the HMS Captain, and it was barely afloat. Acting Captain Brigadier Pedro Pineda ordered the stern guns to fire. To Nelson's relief, the shot veered wide. The Santisima Trinidad, stuck and unable to shoot, tries to grapple, but fails. The weather gauge next hits the HMS Victory, who immediately drops to light sails in anticipation of its next move.
Come along, men! For king and country! Capture that ship!
Yelled Captain Calder. Grapples flew across the space between the Victory and the Santisima Trinidad. The ships closed together and a violent melee ensued. Both first rates were an equal match, and each sword stroke was met with an equal parry, and each British sailor slain was avenged by a Spaniard fallen. But fortune favored the British this day. A few well-placed pistol shots, a few lucky feints and thrusts, gave the British the upper hand. More so, the Victory was a ship no British sailor would easily give up. Losing men rapidly, the crew of the Santisima Trinidad began surrendering one by one. The captain ordered the Spanish ensign to be lowered. The HMS Victory erupted with a victory cry. They had just captured the crown jewel of the Spanish fleet. The Britannia couldn't do much but maneuver into position to support the Victory. Vice Admiral Thompson smiled from ear to ear. Things were finally looking up for the Royal Navy this day. The wind from the west remained a constant. The weather gauge favored the HMS Captain, then the Diana, the dueling San Nicolas and HMS Lively, then the San Josef, the Victory, and lastly, the Britannia. Commodore Nelson limbs the HMS Captain due north to exit the area of engagement, but not before firing a starboard broadside on the distant San Josef as a parting gift. The captain's few surviving long-range guns opened fire, and half the shots connected. To avoid another collision, the Diana dropped its anchors, coming to a halt. It tried grappling onto the HMS Lively, but the attempt failed. Meanwhile, on board the San Nicolas and HMS Lively, the stubborn hand-to-hand fighting continued. Both sides were tired and worn down. The strength and numbers of the largest Spanish ship was too much to bear, and the British suffered staggering losses. Eager to save the lives of his remaining men, Captain Lord Garleys ordered the British ensign to be lowered. The HMS Lively struck its colors in defeat, and the San Nicolas whooped in triumph. Further down the weather gauge, the San Josef sailed straight ahead, past the cowardly and surrendered Santisima Trinidad, coming into clear view with the HMS Britannia on its full starboard broadsides. The San Josef was still highly operational, with its overwhelming firepower brought to bear on the Britannia. Fuses were lit, and a string of Spanish cannons belched angry fire and smoke. Shots shattered the British first rate. The muskets from the crow's nest joined in, but fell short. and the boarding action on the Britannia failed. With nowhere to go and the St. Joseph right in front, the Victory opened up with its bow chasers. The heavy cannons couldn't miss at point-blank range, but the muskets from the British Marines failed to find their mark. The crew of the HMS Victory tried to grapple onto the St. Joseph, but the lines thunked against the three-decker's hull and splashed into the ocean. The St. Joseph's maneuver put it right on collision course with the HMS Britannia. The Britannia lowered its sails, but it was too late. The two massive wooden hulls smashed into each other. With the sheer weight of both first-rate vessels pressed up against each other, bulkheads buckled, boards heaved and shattered, and lines snapped, leaving masts lopsided. Sailors were tossed from yards and ratlines into the water. The remaining men from both ships clung onto whatever they could find. Nothing changed weather-wise. The HMS Captain was the first to act, followed by the Diana, the St. Nicholas, the Victory, then the St. Joseph, and the Britannia. Living to fight another day, the nearly sunk HMS Captain sailed north and disengaged. Blocked on its fore, the captain of the Diana ordered a tacking maneuver, which his crew executed expertly. Turning hard starboard, the Diana's sails raised once again. It bore southeast, putting the HMS Victory within its broadsides. Juan Jose Valera ordered the portside guns to fire. The Spanish frigate's cannons boomed, but the long range and lack of gunnery training caused most of the shots to miss. The Santisima Trinidad was not spared the damage. Finally free from melee combat, the crew of the St. Nicholas raced to their stations, lowering sails and moving the ship forward to engage the remaining British fleet. But it remained blocked, with no chance to shoot its adversaries. The HMS Victory remained blocked. It once again opened up its heavy bow chasers against the St. Joseph. The shots hit easily, while Marines tried to take out Spanish sailors with their muskets. It was time to attempt another boarding action. Equipped with improved grappling hooks and spurred on by the stern eye of Admiral John Jervis, the Victory's men hurled their lines across the way. The St. Joseph's boarding nets almost foiled the attempt, but the Victory had well-trained crew. The ships drew together and fighting broke out. Despite its many casualties, the HMS Victory remained defiant. Its men poured onto the Spanish ship, swinging swords and firing muskets with discipline and feverish zeal. The St. Joseph, battered by constant cannon fire from the British ships, started to wane. More Spaniards than British sailors fell, and the St. Joseph started losing ground. Soon, its captain knew that they could not keep this up and lowered its colors. The HMS Britannia, seeing the Victory's latest conquest, dropped all its sails and made anchor. Oh, how the tides had turned on the Spanish. With the weather gauge unchanging and only 4 ships remaining, things start out with the Diana, the St. Nicholas, followed by the Victory and Britannia. Angered by the surrender of both Spanish first-rate ships, the captain of the Diana ordered battle sails and started maneuvering the frigate to closer cannon range. Without mercy, the Diana opened fire. Its port broadsides thundered to life again, striking both the HMS Victory and St. Joseph indiscriminately. The St. Nicholas, feeling equally betrayed by the striking of colors, sallied forth, narrowly missing the floating wreckage which was once the HMS Minerve. It lined up its own portside guns and fired. The crew of the St. Joseph began to cry out for mercy from their fellow countrymen, but the Spaniards would rather sink their own first-rate ships than allow them to fall into enemy hands. Every available portside gun was ablaze, ripping into the battered HMS Victory and the surrendered St. Joseph without remorse. Unable to untangle itself, the Victory remained anchored and tended to its casualties. The Britannia tacked in place and lined up its stern chasers on the St. Nicholas. The parting shot from the Britannia connected. Cheers rang out among the British ships as they loomed over the captured hulks of the San Josef and the Santisima Trinidad. It was a glorious victory for the Royal Navy. I hope you enjoyed this narrated battle report and that you'll join me for future Black Seas content. Till then, happy hobbying and take care.